Uh, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that has been organized by IIT Before Justice in collaboration with the Students for Democratic Society in US. So the title of the webinar is Solidarity and Political Collectives. What the Black Lives Matter movement teaches us about the cultures of protest. So as you all know, the death of George Floyd on 25th May 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota had sparked a renewed wave of Black Lives Matter movement against systematic racism and police brutality, and has given rise to a conversation worldwide about the political collectives, how the political collectives may protest to bring about significant changes in law and policy on governmental funding of police and other state-owned security infrastructure. With the movement now raging in all major cities in the US, UK, and across the globe, the world is bearing witness to the unabated protest in the midst of a global pandemic and to incidents of violent suppression of protesters with the same police force that they have raised their voice against. So, in this political context, just sections of Indian society whose lives matter the least to the state to initiate conversation with people across the globe who are in similar war front against oppressive regimes, and in an attempt to form lateral networks, which such movements outside our own context. We are organizing a webinar with representatives of SDS, a national student activist organization in the US. So join us for the conversation with these activists and let them explain to us how all this movement is at the ground level and not the maligned interpretation that we hear from the media. So let me invite our speakers, Delilah Amilcar Pierre and Zachary Schultz. So Delilah is an activist based in Tallahassee, Florida, fighting for Black and trans liberation. She has helped create a citywide ban on conversion therapy and fought for community control of the police. A former student at Florida State University, she has devoted time struggling for Black and indigenous recognition and sovereignty. Zachary Schultz is a student activist at Florida State University and a part-time warehouse worker. He is organizing students and workers in Tallahassee, Florida against racism and discrimination against Black people and other oppressed nationalities by police in education and all other aspects of society. So without further ado, let me welcome our speakers. Over to you. Who wants to go first? Zach?
Hello. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I just want to thank you all so much for inviting us to speak. I want to talk a little bit briefly about the history of SDS, what our organization is about, and how we came to be. So SDS was actually refounded in 2006 in opposition to the U.S. imperialist war in Iraq. It took inspiration from the original Students for a Democratic Society, which led the mass mobilization against the U.S. war against Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. And we took a great inspiration from the movement then and wanted to bring it to our generation. Since then, we have been fighting in college campuses and universities and communities across the country for education rights. We've put a significant focus on protecting the rights of undocumented immigrant students on our college campuses and opposing all forms of racism and bigotry, and have been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. For me and many other students, the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2013 by vigilante George Zimmerman brought us into the streets and into the movement to transform our society, to end oppression and bring about true democracy to the people. And that is, what we are doing and organizing today, trying to build this movement to end oppression. And so, Delilah, you can go ahead and speak to the systemic roots in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I also want to thank all of you for having me here today and allowing me to speak. I really appreciate it. And the fact that we're doing this kind of like cross international outreach to each other, dialoguing with each other. I think there's a lot of understanding we can gain and build from that. And so I think when you think about the whole situation and issue of the protests, and you think about the whole situation and issue of racism against Black people in America, you have to think about the course of American history and how systemic racism has affected Black people, especially after Jim Crow. Because, as we all know, during the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s, there were these massive gains and changes for Black people and the rights we were given and had. But again, the United States of America, as it always has done and always will do, has responded by creating new rights and privileges that put Black people in very similar spaces that they were in during these periods of intense segregation and gentrification, during the Jim Crow era, in which we saw the rise of mass incarceration as well as the war on drugs, which was an excuse to massively populate the prisons of America with Black and brown people, where America holds 1/4 of the world's prisoners in the world, and 1 in 3 of those prisoners are a Black person. We saw this rise in gentrification and pushing Black people into spaces of greater poverty. We saw a rise in violence and police brutality against Black people, as well as laws that allowed police to completely escape with committing any crime or act they want without accountability being given to them. In Florida, there's something called the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, which essentially makes it impossible for us to internally investigate a police organization. This Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, as well as the other privileges given to police officers, often make it almost impossible to hold them accountable. I think we also have to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement during the Obama era and Obama presidency, where Zach has talked about the life of Trayvon Martin. That was especially influential for me since I live in Florida and live in Tampa. And Trayvon Martin's death, where he was killed by a man named George Zimmerman, a white vigilante who murdered him because a neighborhood watch pointed out that a Black boy was in their community. I think it really changed and affected my whole perception of the Black Lives Matter movement and of what was happening in our country surrounding the issue of police brutality. I remember very specifically that issue being brought up and talked about with peers, with others, but especially this kind of lens still of not accepting the real brutality of the police force against Black people. And so we've seen this massive resistance against Black people on the war on drugs, during mass incarceration, for the most basic rights to be established for Black people in this country, kind of coagulate, solidify into this mass movement we see today.
So we were asked to speak about to what extent this moment, these protests today, are a new development, versus a continuity. And I think that there's definitely aspects of both. Over the last decade, we've seen, I think, a number of intense struggles in the United States. For our generation, not only the brutal wars waged in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in particular the economic crisis, which shook the U.S. economy to its core. I think really not only did it play a major role in impoverishing many people in the United States, but it also put to question the nature of our system. With the economic crisis, what we saw is many Black people being forced out of their jobs into lower paying positions, people losing their homes, people losing many of the gains that they had seen in the high point of the economy. And the fact is that, to this day, the economy in the United States has remained in crisis for the last decade. And the economic impoverishment and exploitation of the people is a major factor. At the beginning of 2009, Oscar Grant was shot and killed by Bay Area police in California, and the people rose up in protest and against police suppression. They rose up and they fought back in extremely militant ways. And since then, in 2009, we've seen uprisings happen across the country, in New York City and Ferguson, in Baltimore and Milwaukee, and now we see uprisings happening all across the country of people who are tired and sick of the oppression that they face every day by the police, by the impoverishment and exploitation of this society, and against the general oppression of racism that pervades all aspects of life, from housing to healthcare to education to social interaction. The movement around the killing of Trayvon Martin was when the slogan Black Lives Matter first emerged in 2013. And in the the rising of the people in protest then against this brutal killing, as well the protest that emerged when his killer was completely acquitted in the courts, exposed how bankrupt the criminal justice system and the entire system of policing and courts is in the United States. And people started to take on the call of Black Lives Matter to demand that the oppression of Black people come to an end in the United States, and that our generation cannot stand still while we allow Black people to be oppressed any further. So since then, the movement has never been able to fully coalesce into a strong national organization or countrywide political movement. But with each year, activists and organizers on the ground have been gaining more experience in the movement. We've been taking all steps we can to organize and to coordinate. And what we hope to see out of this moment today is further opportunities to forge these protests into a countrywide political movement that can drive forward further change.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about how the COVID-19 epidemic is related to these protests and related to kind of like this struggle for Black Lives Matter in our country. So as y'all probably know to some extent, the United States response to the COVID-19 epidemic has been absolutely preposterous. Our country has done nothing really to help us support the millions of people who have become unemployed because of this epidemic. They've sent out a $1,200 stimulus check to a few students. I mean, not even students. Students can't get the stimulus check. Dependents can't get the stimulus check. So only independents over a certain income level can get this stimulus check. This $1,200 stimulus check has been the only thing that really has been given to the people, while no advancements or public works have really been made, except for a few COVID-19 testing facilities here and there to help stop the outbreak of COVID-19. Many places, especially in the South, in Florida and Georgia and Texas, began to reopen in the middle of the pandemic, basically, risking the lives of workers here. And for many Black and brown people in this country, they are essential workers anyway. They have to work to survive. They work at places that never close because they need to be open during the COVID-19 epidemic. They have implemented and instituted nearly no policy changes or PPE, meaning kind of like personal safety equipment for people in these spaces. I actually worked as an essential worker during the COVID-19 epidemic, and the most they did was take my temperature before and after I left They didn't implement any real social distancing protocol or policies. So Black and brown communities are not only, at the constant risk they face every day, but also at the risk of the COVID-19 epidemic, killing Black people in disproportionately larger numbers because of what's happening. Indigenous communities in America are dying at disproportionately larger numbers because those communities are essentially being left out to suffer while COVID rages on in our communities. And so I think that's a huge reason for the factors of why the Black Lives Matter movement has also grown into such like a nationwide movement and protest. It's a protest also, I think, against the conditions of COVID-19 and the structural failure of our system and taking care of everyone, because everyone is suffering from the COVID-19 epidemic, but particularly Black and brown communities. So I can move on to the reasons for the protest, where Zach definitely talked all about like the Black Lives Matter movement. I talked a little bit about COVID-19 and how that affects the protest. I think for a long time, there has kind of finally been this approach towards Black Lives Matter, towards the deaths of police brutality that has really stirred up, I think, public conversation and movement towards people better understanding the fight and solidarity that is necessary for Black lives in this country. I think the constant conversation, work, and organizing of activists all around the country, such as the National Alliance Against Political and Racist Repression, has finally combined with, of course, the COVID-19 epidemic, everything that's happening economically in our country. It's important to not forget that millions of people have been essentially forced out of work with no means to gain unemployment funds or anything to prepare themselves. In Florida, 86% of the people who apply for unemployment do not get it. So the majority of people who apply for unemployment are left out of luck. They have no means to refund themselves or help themselves. People can barely live past one paycheck here. So it's not good for a lot of people in their economic situations. I think all of that combined, especially with the approach of the Republican and Democratic administrations. I think an important part of it also, even though I think, of course, we should focus on direct action and not the electoral struggle, is that people cannot find an avenue in political electoralism and voting through that channel to express their rage and frustration. During the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, they're literally like the whole issue of kind of like the electoral politics and channel in our country has been diverted and funneled, where elections would still run in our country even during the pandemic, essentially making it very difficult for people to be able to vote and obstructing that way of them showing their support for the system. A candidate who was very highly favored and praised in our country named Bernie Sanders was kind of seen as the left alternative to Trump. He's the social democratic candidate in the United States of America. And he lost to he lost to Joe Biden, who is a liberal Democrat who's basically to the very right of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, throughout years and years of complying with the Republican Party in our country, has moved farther and farther to agreeing with the ideas of the right, to essentially looking the same as the right in our country, even in the eyes of people who necessarily used to identify or align themselves with the Democratic Party, or still do. And so people are also frustrated on that electoral level, knowing that there's really no choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, knowing that whether either one of them are president, they both do not represent the values and integrity they feel that a president should have, knowing that that's not an alternative or outlet, and knowing also that there really is no way to vote to change, like the systemic brutality of the police department and force in our country.
Yeah, I think so I'm going to talk a little bit about how this movement has been organized and how it came into being. I think a really important factor that can't be ignored is the kind of social media age that we have entered into, where unlike maybe a decade ago, we on our social media feeds on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere, we can see every single day videos of brutal executions and murders by the police. I think that, that just the chilling brutality of the killing of George Floyd, um, mobilized people in a way that I don't know if I could imagine otherwise. And kind of, I think as a result of this, the increasing role of social media, large aspects of the movement are entirely spontaneous. Um, you see many people who maybe have never been to a protest before in their lives or have never been involved in political activism or organizing, um, talking to their friends and calling protests, and they make a post on Twitter, on Facebook, and hundreds of people show out into the streets with them. This is happening all across the country. 2 weeks ago, on Friday and Saturday, right at the end of May, when we all saw in Minneapolis the utter brutality of the Minneapolis Police Department in suppressing the protests and the uprising of the people there who were filled with rage and anger and frustration, who took to burning down many buildings they viewed that represented the oppressive system, to shopping for free at the many stores that routinely harass and discriminate against Black customers. And this mobilized people in a way that I've never seen. And, we talk regularly with older, veterans from the movement, who have seen the struggle in the United States for many decades. And I think what is clear, to almost anyone I talk to is that what we're seeing right now is completely unprecedented. There are many organizations that were forged and, built out of the last decade of struggle. And we play a role in trying to call demonstrations and actions, to do political education, to try to cohere concrete demands and put a political program to the rage. But what is clear to all of us is that we are seeing more people, take to the streets and demand change than we ever have seen before. I know here in Florida, in the city of Jacksonville, they organized a demonstration of 10,000 people, which, from my understanding, is the largest in that city's history. I'm sure for many cities across the country, it's the same story. These are the largest demonstrations in the entire history of many of these cities. And for us right now, what we're thinking a lot about is there a way to cohere this movement into one with concrete demands, a political program, something that we can come together to and push forward, because the reality is that the various liberal political forces that have no intent of dealing with the root issues of systemic racism or police brutality are working to take advantage of the spontaneous and disconnected nature of the movement to pacify people with lies, with meaningless cosmetic reforms that will do nothing to put an end to the brutality and the oppression that Black people face in this country. So to that end, Students for a Democratic Society has joined with labor unions, with community organizations, and other student groups all across the country. And last year, we all went together to refound the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. We hope that this organization will be able to really unite the different strains of the movement across the country and cohere it, into something concrete. Our main focus has been on calling for community control of the police. We believe that what we are looking at is a fundamental issue of democracy, which is that the police in our society are not accountable to the people. They're not accountable to the neighborhoods or the communities that they police, and that they will never be accountable in their current form. And so to that end, we are calling for community control. But I will be clear, our role and the national organization, and coalition that we work with are just one aspect of a very, very broad movement. This is a huge movement that almost every political force in the country is involved in trying to approach in some way.
Yeah, I think that was a really great statement. And speaking of kind of like the mobilization for the protests and just talking a little bit more on the co-optation of the protests, there's a lot of interesting ways that I've even seen personally that people are trying to co-opt the protests and co-opt kind of like the more radical spirit of the protest. I think that the liberal approach and agenda is kind of to, instead of forcing these protests to be about justice and accountability for Black lives against the police, to make it seem as if these protests are a way to heal some lost connection between the police force and Black and brown communities. Liberals want to co-opt the narrative and say essentially that, oh, this isn't about the police being a systemic force that has brutalized and oppressed Black people for centuries. It's about the relationship between the police and Black people having lost its way, essentially having gone in the wrong direction. Some pretty ridiculous and really weird argument they've kind of gone by. And that's why you'll see things that will really shock you in the United States, like people doing the Cupid shuffle with police officers kneeling in front of protesters, or even white people kissing the feet of Black people or getting on the ground and saying that they're renouncing their white privilege, which is really funny and may seem, like they're trying their best and being genuine, but essentially does nothing to, remove the systemic causes of why Black people are being brutalized and oppressed every day. Like, would I love 20 white people to get on the floor and talk about kissing my feet? Maybe. Is it going to end police brutality? I don't think so. And so I'm not really going to ask for that. I'm asking for the removal of the system that oppresses my brethren and kin. That's what we want. And so I think when you kind of think about how to mobilize for these protests, I think it all depends on, of course, you're planning an organization. I think one thing that I think I've seen SDS, for instance, Tampa's SDS be so successful at, this organization in Jacksonville, called Jacksonville Community Action Committee, but as well as Jacksonville SDS organized with, and our SDS chapter organized with, is creating protests that are organized and central, creating protests where people know that they can feel safe and protected by the organizers in charge. You got to have a route planned out. You got to be able to really tell people what you're going to be doing once they get there. You need to be clear about the directions. One tactic that we have been using has been car caravans. So we can block off the police from the back and block off any kind of traffic or cars that try to hit us, because someone actually tried to run over a few protesters at a protest in Tallahassee. He wasn't charged, by the way. He got off scot-free. Free today, which is ridiculous, obviously, but that's how the U.S. police are. Yeah. And so I think first and foremost, people will mobilize behind you if they can trust your organization and they can say, I know this organization is going to have a real plan. I know their objective is going to be like focusing on our safety and focusing on our unity. I think it's also about having very clear demands of what you want and what you want to do. I think something that Zach says a lot that I've been meditating on, and I think is an intelligent approach, is like people will get tired if they keep on going to the same protest, doing the same thing, and feeling like nothing's changing. You need to have direct goals and accomplishments to be fulfilling and setting. So when you go and you schedule a protest, you can't just say, we're protesting for Black Lives Matter. I mean, you can just say that, but a more effective protest, the protest that gets people moving, the protest that gets people to really change the confrontations, to really change power in our country, is to get people on specific demands. That's why we were fighting specifically in Tallahassee for community control of the police, for the arrest and indictment of Zachary Jones, the killer of Michael Johnson, and for the arrest and indictment of whoever Tony McDade's killer is. They haven't released his name yet. If y'all don't know, Michael Johnson and Tony McDade are two Black men who were killed in Tallahassee. Tony McDade is a trans man as well. So we've been trying to get justice for the both of them for quite a little while. Tony McDade, since he died May 27th, and Michael Johnson, since he died on March 20th, before the uprising had even started. And so the Students for a Democratic Society and other student organizations have been helping community organizations fight for justice on these issues. And we found that mass mobilization works best when we give these clear demands as to what we want, as to how we're going to accomplish things, as to how we're going to get things done, because then people are more likely and willing to come because they feel like an objective is being completed, a goal is being solved, there is a solution to reach. Also, you need to have good speakers, I think. Like, you need to have people who can speak to the concerns and issues of what's happening and speak very clearly about that. You need to be willing to give space for the oppressed and marginalized in your community to speak, to have a voice on the mic, and be careful that it feels planned and structured. I think it's all about, to mobilize well, you just need to have a well-structured, well-organized protest and take advantage of the moment, especially right now.
Mm-hmm. I want to speak to one characteristic of these protests, which is that it is almost entirely led by youth and students, many of whom are emerging like entirely in this moment. I think that students have been finding very interesting ways to respond and to interact with these movements. And in Minneapolis, the Students for a Democratic Society there was able to actually force their university to completely cut ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, which is, I think, maybe a first in the United States, and something which greatly inspires student activists across the country. But also to moving forward as we come back to campuses, as the pandemic comes to an end, to address the racism that exists in our education system. What we see is that Black people are systematically excluded from the universities, from education, and it is something that we've been concerned about. Just one example here in Tallahassee, we population of our city is about 37% Black, while the university campus is 8% Black. These kind of huge disparities are extremely common throughout the United States, with the systemic exclusion of Black people from education. We see that similar types of exclusion and discrimination in housing and jobs, in healthcare. The United States does not have any kind of universal healthcare, so many Black people, especially, are uninsured and have no access to healthcare, and nothing has been done to that in this pandemic as well. So, we're thinking about many ways that we can target racism in our society moving forward, and the particular role that students can play. And I want to speak a little bit to the international question because you know, we were asked to speak about, you know, the international, you know, elements of this movement and how people around the world, you know, can take part and show solidarity. And I think it's kind of, you know, it can be a difficult question. From our analysis, we understand that this system of capitalism, of imperialism, is global, and that, you know, any attempt to fight it is going to have international dimensions. So, you know, from that understanding, we know that international solidarity and joining together across the world is going to be very important. And I think that, you know, what we've seen here is, you know, when we see, you know, people in other countries organize protests, you know, we see people all around the world march on U.S. embassies and denounce the crimes of the United States government. And people across the United States see that, and it, you know, builds a real feeling of solidarity and connection with the movements around the world. I know that, you know, one thing that we've seen is a real connection between the Palestinian people and Black people in the United States. One thing that was very striking back in 2014, when the uprising in Ferguson happened, is that it happened simultaneous to the brutal Israeli bombing of Gaza. And so the people who rose up in Ferguson, you know, had Palestinian flags that they rose high, and because they recognized, you know, for example, that many U.S. police departments in the United States are actually trained by the IDF and get this, you know, kind of special training on how to suppress protests and crowds from the Israeli government. I think it shows in one way, you know, how the forces of oppression are international. They train and work together and collaborate. They share tactics and strategies on how to suppress people's movements. And in the same way, it seems clear that we also need to be capable of having these global conversations where we share and spread tactics, strategies, ways to build the movement, so that we all can, you know, develop to a higher level. One thing, just, you know, on the movement in the United States, and I think Delilah spoke to a little bit, but I'm going to just draw it out explicitly, is that while it was the killing of George Floyd that brought everybody out into the streets, what's been extremely important about this moment, unlike in 2014 and 2015, around the killings of Michael Brown and of Freddie Gray, that the level of organization and consciousness has grown. And so pretty much every protest in the country is not just justice for George Floyd, but is actually focused on local issues of police brutality. What people have realized in the last few years is that there are cases of police violence and brutality in every single city in the United States, that it's so deeply systemic and widespread that it is something that can be fought on the local level. And I think that internationally, what's been really great to see is that when people draw solidarity to the movement in the United States and bring forward demands and struggle against the police repression and violence that they face in their own countries, bringing up local cases of where people who need justice, local demands that connect to the mass movements in each country, while also you know, showing solidarity. And I think that that's, you know, very important, that when we all build our respective movements that correspond to the local felt needs of the people where we are, and then help them understand that all oppressed people all across the world have a common struggle with each other. Maybe that is a start of kind of bringing into being, a global like humanity.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think there's a lot to say, especially about, I think, how this movement has changed and how like the scope of Black Lives Matter has been changing. I think definitely, especially like the focus of Black Lives Matter, especially in its earlier embryonic stages, was specifically just on the struggles of Black men against police brutality. But I think now that conversation has changed, especially if you think about the issue of Breonna Taylor, who I think is probably the most popular or at least most sensationalized like Black woman who has been killed recently by the police. The police literally killed her while she was sleeping. They thought she was a suspect that they already had in custody. They walked into her house while she was asleep after her shift as an EMT, which is basically a medical service person, and they shot her 12 times. And her case and everything going around has been getting a lot of traction. And it's interesting also seeing the Tony McDade situation and seeing how people are responding to that. Because I think that although Michael Johnson's death is just as important and matters just as much as Tony McDade's death, his identity as a Black trans man has given it more national attention than we would have thought. Like it's definitely like it's a national situation where like people all around the country and even outside of the country are donating to Tony McDade, where protests in New Orleans, Georgia, these queer and trans centers of the US focus and center Tony McDade or place him as someone who has been affected by police brutality. So it's interesting seeing how kind of like these different regions of America based on kind of like identity and especially their solidarity with queer and trans people have taken up these different kind of like lens and looks at the Black Lives Matter movement and extended its focus. Because I think as wonderful and successful as the Black Lives Matter movement has been, there is a lot of failure for Black people, specifically Black cisgender men, to understand that the Black Lives Matter movement needs to be inclusive and encompass all of the Black people who are murdered and killed by police brutality. Because yes, of course, Black men are killed and brutalized by the police, but as a trans woman, like so many trans women are killed and brutalized by the police force in America. Black trans women literally die all the time, and they're not searched for, they're not looked for, or were killed, harassed, and raped by the police. And so the fact that this is a topic of conversation and the fact that trans people who are Black in this country can gain so much traction is, I think, an interesting development. And I'm curious to see how that will extend into the future and extend into kind of like America and specifically Black people's ideas and understandings, both of the role of women in organizing and the Black liberation movement and the role of queer and trans people in the Black liberation movement. And that takes me to how to change the perceptive and narrative of the media. I don't necessarily know what conditions y'all are going through or like if y'all have, can take the same roles that we can. But I think that the way we do it, the way we kind of like change that perceptive and narrative of the media is one, starting very early and being very clear about our demands and what we do. We've been very lucky to gain a far larger social media presence and traction online, which has given us more space to outreach, more space to spread the message, more space to spread the word. But we also are constantly holding press conferences where we will discuss a situation and spin a more radical light, a more progressive light on it. Like we had a press conference about Tony McDade talking about his murder, asking and pleading people to understand the reality of the situation and give nuance to a situation, to not assume that he's just a crazed killer or something, because he he stabbed someone before he died, like a night before his death. And although the situation is really complicated, he was basically brutally beaten by people. He was basically brutally beaten by some people who were basically harassing him for his trans identity. And so we wanted to kind of clarify the whole situation on that. I think it's reaching out to the media and releasing, you need to be releasing statements about what your intention is, what your plan is, what you want to do. Reaching out and getting into contact with the media. We have someone in SDS and our other organizations who are constantly like reaching us out to the media, letting them know what's happening. You have to be there from the beginning, realigning perspectives, and you have to respond. You have to respond to different political statements and public statements made, even if it isn't necessarily good for all of your interpersonal relationships. Where I wrote a response to a message that our community's LGBTQ plus advisory board created. So in Tallahassee, there's an LGBTQ plus advisory board, but what they are is essentially just the mayor's way of kind of deflecting from homophobia and transphobia in our city. He can point to them and be like, look, I made you this board of 5 people who do absolutely nothing for anyone except themselves. And that means I care about queer and trans people in Tallahassee, even though, of course, there are disproportionate rates of like poverty, especially in like the Black, queer, and trans community. I posted a response article to a statement that someone had made, basically saying that it was okay for Tony McDade's mother to misgender him and to dead name him during his funeral, and that like she had full control over whatever happened. And although I got some flack for that, I think it was important to write and important to like say, because you need to be able to like respond critically and effectively to these arguments that people make against you. When someone comes out to slander you or to say that your organization is doing like all this evil stuff, if you can point to real evidence of what you've done effectively, and you can point to different conversations, relationships you've made with news people, press conferences you did, you can show your consistency and how your consistency beats whatever their lies they're telling about you. And even if the lies they tell about you are detrimental to your organization for a little while, your consistency will be what people eventually end up seeing and focusing on. Your consistency, your ability to have deep reach within your community, within the student movement. It's interesting also bringing this up because SDS has definitely been facing a lot of flack and has had trouble building itself because of its personal reputation. I actually originally didn't join Students for a Democratic Society because I was told that someone in Students for a Democratic Society was a rapist, ironically, by someone else who was a abuser. And so these rumors that are completely unfounded about Students for a Democratic Society have been circling around this around our university and preventing people from joining Students for a Democratic Society. But they were able to kind of like realign the attention of the media and realign kind of public opinion on our campus by the campaigns we underwent and the media surrounding the campaigns we underwent. Where Students for a Democratic Society did a sexual assault campaign on campus, fighting to have our schools administration have real accountability for sexual assaulters, have them prohibited and removed from their positions at our university, and other such things. I think that fight, the attention around it, and the way we spun and worked with it really did change a lot of people's perceptions of Students for a Democratic Society and lead people to understand that we're an organization that is totally and completely against sexual assault. So I think there are like a lot of different methods and means to go by it, but you just need to like facilitate and create a relationship with your local news organizations or local media people. Be making and building effective campaigns that people can look to and point back to, and be sure to be documenting your work and your struggle so that when people try to question you and your consistency, you have something to show to them.
And just one point on the media, sometimes, it can be difficult, right, to ever get our positions across in the corporate media, but that's not always our only options, especially in the age of social media and wide access to the internet. So focusing on like socialist publications and newspapers, Black newspapers and publications, various like alternative publications that will allow us to speak with our voice and to put forward our perspective, unadulterated and uncomplicated, is important. There is real value in building up our own newspapers and our own publications and going around your city to distribute them and to talk to people. Many people, a lot of students and youth, organize almost entirely, just online. But there is what we would try to encourage and focus, is the value of going, into the neighborhoods, canvassing, going to popular, like stores, and standing out there and, distributing material, reaching outside, of just, the campus or, youth, outside of just, the social media, networks we have, and actually getting out there and trying to, meet with the masses of people, in your community, and to communicate and to spread information that way as well. So actually, Delilah, do you want to actually pick up and talk a bit about Obama and the Democratic Party, and then I'll talk on Trump?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Obama and the Democratic Party, I remember especially, I was happy when Obama got elected because I was 13 and I didn't understand the fact that Barack Obama is the president of the United States, which means he's president of the war machine of imperialists who ruin and destroy so many people's countries and so many people's lives. But I think for a lot of Black Americans, especially considering the fact that there is no real political education as to the real history of the United States in our country, it's completely and totally wiped out and whitewashed over. A lot of progressives, a lot of Black Americans saw Obama as this beacon and figure of hope, of this wishy-washy, vague idea of systemic change within our country. But two things happened. One, nothing changed in our country, really. And a lot of people have different opinions as to why that happened. Some people say it's because the Republican Party was blocking Obama's every attempt and move to try to change and do anything. Some people, I think more rightfully, say that Obama was complicit in working with the Republican Party and trying to compromise with the conservatives, which basically diluted any real progressive plan he had. But essentially, people began to see, especially from the Black radical sector of the United States of America, that this identity politics and believing that just because of someone's skin color, they're going to radically change a system of oppression that has oppressed people for hundreds of years wasn't going to work. The Black Lives Matter movement erupted during Obama's presidency, and he called, in fact, I believe he called someone who was killed during the Black Lives Matter movement a thug, has essentially done nothing or said nothing about what was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, kept his mouth shut because it was too risky for him personally to support it. And he doesn't take risks. He's the president. So I think all of this combined with the fact that there's this Black radical movement, there's people moving into kind of like a more socialist, more left-leaning political view and line, has created this sentiment of disillusionment with the Democratic Party, with what they can do in our country. But then on top of that, the Democratic Party has been outright failing, both at their attempts to make these gestures of and symbolism of false solidarity with the people, but also at any attempt to establish the fact that they're competent or efficient. Where Hillary Clinton lost badly to Donald Trump in the primaries, they've put Joe Biden up as the presidential candidate, and their response to the murder of George Floyd was, instead of to do anything useful, like anything useful, they decided to wear kente cloths, which are this like African printed, what is it, a scarf or something? It's really bad, y'all. Like, it's maybe the most horrifying thing I can think of in my mind right now. But they decided to wear these cloths and kneel for 9 minutes on the floor in quote unquote solidarity with George Floyd, which just came off, to anyone who is really looking or watching as so insincere, so pointless. I think on top of that, the Democratic Party has truly proven their failures and unwillingness to change the system during this pandemic, where the Democratic Party has proposed far more expansive, funds for the people, things to help people, but absolutely none of it has gotten passed. So I think to a lot of people, even if they think they're good intentioned, their ineffectiveness and lack of impact is really, really affecting their public opinion of the party. As for the Democratic Party's response to the protest and response to what's happening, I think they are definitely on the wave of defund, very, very low amounts defund. Or even Bernie Sanders said he didn't want to defund the police, that we need to give more funds to all of our public sectors. So some of them are not even on the defund wave, even the radicals, but they're definitely trying to co-opt kind of like this liberal narrative of healing in our country. They place this narrative and exception on the fact that we need to heal, and are the ones pushing this idea that kind of like this fight against police brutality is instead this reformist, I don't know, healing walk so that communities and police officers can magically have a better relationship. And I think they've definitely also been pushing this idea that instead of actually fundamentally restructuring the police or giving people power over the police, with a little defunding, with a little rebranding and name changing, people can actually change how the police function and operate.
Yeah. So I know we're about to the end of our time. I'm going to speak really quickly on Trump, and then you should let me know if we have to go to Q&A at that point. But coming from the failures of the Democratic Party, they speaking to their candidates, they put up Hillary Clinton and now Joe Biden. Both people who actually are intimately involved in the oppression of Black people. They both played a key role in the 90s in pushing forward these crime bills. These are laws which greatly increase the number and length of imprisonment, particularly in Black communities, making any drug possession, like very, very harsh penalties for any drug possession. They put in these policies called 3 strikes, where if you commit 3 even low-level crimes, you're considered a career criminal and are given extremely long sentences for maybe decades, even for small, like minor, like drug possession charges, mandatory minimums. So certain crimes, regardless of the nature of them, can land you in 20 years in the prisons. And I want to be clear about the nature of the prisons in the United States. Just here in Florida, hundreds and hundreds of people die every single year in the prisons, and this is going to be greatly exacerbated this year because of the COVID pandemic. We've been calling, along with the National Alliance and other forces to free as many people as possible from the prisons and jails, which we view as basically death sentences at this point, because of the horrid conditions. But in any case, the failures of the Democratic Party, brought forward Donald Trump in 2016, which was a great shock to the masses of people in the United States, and led to many major mobilizations for all kinds of democratic rights and against oppression, mass mobilizations for the rights of women, who women continue to be oppressed and discriminated against in many ways in the United States. The anti-immigrant attitudes of the right-wing Trump administration, such as the Muslim ban and the deportation camps, the many ways that the Trump administration has spread their white supremacist agenda, has mobilized people, and especially the youth and students, for the last several years, in large demonstrations and actions against all forms of racism and white supremacy. And these mobilizations, I think, have especially played a major role in bringing many white people into the movement. And that's, I think, one thing that's been very striking for people in the United States, and I know around the world, is that when you look at the demonstrations in the United States today, you'll find about half, or maybe even the majority of these protests being white people or just not Black. And I think it's just this growing awareness of how deeply rooted racism is in this country. One thing we talk about a lot here actually is the history of the police departments. In our city, we've actually done our historical research, and we've traced the founding of our police department back to the slave catching patrols that used to protect the system of slavery of Black people in Florida and other parts of the South. And it's this kind of growing awareness of the deep rootedness of racism and the difficulty of uprooting it has radicalized and mobilized the great masses of people in America, including many white youth and students who are now joining and you join the struggle in large numbers, which I think is an extremely powerful development that indicates that this movement that is growing is one which cuts across the entirety of our society. It cuts through all identities and aspects and positions, that it's becoming a real popular movement, which we hope can be forged into a new political force, that we won't have to put up with the same establishment politics, the corrupt two-party system, and that there is an opportunity that we can seize moving forward. But oh, go on.
I wanted to say that I agree, and I wanted to talk because a specific question that was asked to us beforehand was on whether the protests are more socialist or liberal, which is path of it hasn't been determined. But I think Zach is very correct when, literally, these protests are spontaneous at many, many times. One of the first days protesting, I remember a protest that SDS was a part of, and a protest that someone had randomly organized, meet and intersected with each other, and there was like hundreds of people there. But like random people or just people in the community will call these protests, will call these actions. So it really depends on what organization in a community holds the real power to influence the politics in America. So like it's definitely based on locality and region, but I'd say like in Tallahassee, I would say that our organization and these protests are more, even though not all of these protests have explicitly, like openly socialist or anti-capitalist politics, although ours definitely do. I have specifically talked about going from an anti-capitalist and socialist approach at these protests, and our policies, I think, are definitely in alignment with that. It depends on who essentially holds political leadership in their city right now. For instance, in Chicago, I would say that the protests are mostly socialist or leaning far left because of the leadership of Frank Chapman and the Chicago radicals who are pushing for community control of the police in their city. And Tallahassee and Jacksonville, I'd also say, because organizations in these cities have real power, that the protests are more towards a socialist line. But it's hard to know or say because I think a lot of people in America still, while they're developing an antagonism towards capitalism and an antagonism towards the structure of their society, they haven't come to this place where they're willing to accept and study socialism or even like take it at its basic precepts. They're still kind of confused on what it actually means.
Let's see. Do we need to go to a Q&A now, or where are we at? Because I mean,
I think we can go to Q&A. So one of the questions that we got right now was about education in the United States. So like the question is, US is a developed nation. Education has taken its inclination in the USA in the early 20th century. How education of the people did not eradicate the discriminatory behavior? Or is the education system starting from primary school, is it kind of aiding the already established structural racism? So what role does education system play in it?
If I may take this one, Zach, unless you really want it.
Absolutely. I can speak, but you speak first.
Yeah. Our education system is so incredibly racist here and so incredibly in alignment with the structure of US politics. There are a few places where things are more radical or people are presented with more radical ideas. Like, for instance, in Zach's class, in his high school, I wish I went there, he got to read Howard Zinn and some radicals. But for the most part, even in like these special programs, the US completely and totally ignores the realities of systemic racism in our country. I remember for my school, and I went to a magnet school. So like I went to this school called Hillsborough High School, but I went to a magnet program inside the school. And the way the US works is they'll put magnet programs, which are like these programs for quote unquote advanced students in poor schools, essentially because they're trying to say that, oh, by putting these magnet programs in these poorer schools, we're getting more resources for these poorer schools. But what they're essentially doing is they're taking the energy and attention of these schools and focusing it all on a few white students who go there, giving them more privileges and attention than everyone else in the school. So I went to this magnet school, and I was one of four black. Well, I'm a black woman, and there was a 6 or 7 black women there, but because they identify me as a black man, I was one of 4 black men who went to this school. There was no conversation about racism or the politics of it or what it really was. There was conversations about things like whether the Civil War was about slavery or about states' rights, meaning essentially states' rights to have slavery, but it's just a way to kind of like divert from how you can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery, how it was a conflict about slavery and about Black people's rights and autonomy in our country. We had one day where we talked about the civil rights movement and Black liberation in our country. the Black Panther Party was portrayed to me as violent and cruel. Any groups who fought for I didn't learn much else about Black liberation, but very often we played roles where teachers would even be like, well, you know, slave masters fed and clothed their slaves, so they weren't that bad. There were some good things about them. The US, especially history classes, but the entirety of the US system backs racism in practice and in theory, both in the classes and in the way they structure schools, making sure that they create programs where white and Asian students feel superior. Well, mostly white students feel superior to Black students.
Yeah, I think some aspects of the education system in the United States. So education, what was segregated between Black and white, throughout Jim Crow in the United States, and today, although segregation in education has been formally abolished, it still exists in practice, which is that schools throughout this country are mostly divided, where you'll have wealthier, whiter students go to one school, and working class and poor students in Black communities have separate schools. And what you see is that schools that have mostly Black and poor students are severely underfunded. Teachers are paid very, very poorly. They don't have equipment or resources. Actually, you have a major movement in the United States to privatize a lot of the public education system and to put it into the hands of private corporations so that they can run them entirely with their own curriculum. But even in the public education system, we've seen more and more aspects of the public education system be privatized, where private corporations with right-wing political views print the textbooks, they create the curriculum, they drive what's being educated. And one of the important things in the United States is actually the struggle of teachers. And, we're starting to see a lot of teachers who are going on strike and rebelling and organizing themselves to try to change the education system in the United States. But right now it's in very poor shape.
Okay, so one of the other things was how the stories of the Native Americans are completely being ignored in the textbooks, and how their struggles and what the settlers did to them is completely being ignored as a community.
Yeah, Zach, I'm good. Okay. Well, it's interesting because so basically the struggle of indigenous people for their rights and security in the United States is completely ignored. As Zach said, these textbooks and the materials that are being produced and given to students are usually from right-wing companies, right-wing manufacturers and producers. So when they talk about the struggle of Native American people in the United States of America, they'll talk about, they'll give lip service to what has happened to Native Americans. They'll talk about the Trail of Tears and how awful that was, and Andrew Jackson's treatment of Native American people to some extent. And they'll talk about, a little bit about kind of like the actions of Native American people being removed from their lands by American settlers, but they mostly ignore the full extent of genocide, attack, and encroachment that the United States did on Native American land. And they'll play off the genocide that the United States committed against Native American people as not relevant. They'll say that the majority of the reason why Native American people died in America was just because of disease, and because disease killed them all off, basically. So they basically kind of, when they're not completely ignoring the history or just not telling us what's happening, use the lens of disease to kind of ignore the full-scale extent of genocide against Native American people in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that's important is to talk about the oppression that indigenous people face today, because as Delilah said, there are plenty of people who will give some lip service to the oppression and the genocide against Native American people in the past, but today you see that indigenous people continue to live on these reservations with some of the worst conditions in the United States, with terrible land, horrible infrastructure, no access to resources, no reparations. Um, the United States has continually violated the treaties that it has signed with indigenous nations, um, continually um, betraying indigenous people and violating their rights. I think, um, what was really striking, for us and hopefully for people around the world was the resistance at Standing Rock when in 2016, indigenous people stood up against the pipeline that was being pushed through the Dakotas that was going to poison their waters and their lands to destroy the environment and continue the destruction of indigenous communities. And, we speak to this because, what is, very broadly ignored is the continued oppression that indigenous people face. I think it's very relevant to the conversation about police brutality because, actually, if you break down um, police brutality, um, proportionately to the different nationalities in the United States, you see that indigenous people actually have the highest rate of murder by police in the United States, corresponding to their share of the population. And you see this especially in the western part of the United States, where there are still many indigenous people, or even in Minneapolis, where the National Guard actually fired on the indigenous people in Minneapolis and their communities. They maintain their own kind of like neighborhood defense and like guards and like night watches, and they had actually received permission, formal recognition, by the city of Minneapolis to carry out their own self-defense of their communities, and yet they were fired on by the U.S. National Guard. And I think that it's extremely connected um, to the struggle that's being waged today.
Okay. So we have another question. How is this protest going to affect the elections? If even if it skews towards Democrats, they aren't going to budge of defending. Will there be any good outcome expected from this other than paper police reforms?
Yeah. So I think it's clear that the decision of Donald Trump to use violent suppression of the movements has made him wildly unpopular with the American people, even more than before. And so I think that in many ways this is very much hurt his chances in the elections. But the very serious problem is that while the American people are in large numbers recognize just the criminal nature of the Trump administration, there is no alternative, and there's many ways that the U.S. government uses to suppress the vote and to suppress the democratic process. So, for example, we just saw there were some elections in the state of Georgia just the previous week, and what you see is that polling places in the Black communities are extremely limited. So you'll have people, who will have to wait in line basically all day just to cast a vote in the Black community, while in white neighborhoods and white areas, there's significantly more polling places and more eligibility to vote. Here in the state of Florida, one of our major struggles was that people who had been in prison actually were stripped of the right to vote even after release in the state of Florida. And there was a Democratic referendum that has tried to have this overturned, but the right-wing Republican political leaders of our state have basically done everything in their ability to keep former prisoners disenfranchised and to prevent them the right to vote. And this is extremely important because of the nature of the U.S. policing and the criminal system, that a significant amount of the Black population are imprisoned and are disenfranchised from the vote. And there's just many ways. You have voter ID laws where you have to be able to present identification, paperwork or cards in order to vote, which many poor people, immigrants and Black people are unable to always have or to be able to present, which keeps them from voting, and just many different ways that prevents any third parties or any alternative parties, Republicans and Democrats, from being able to get on the ballot or to participate in the election process. Does not give the American people spells the real serious problem for actually getting substantial reforms. What the Democrats are proposing right now in Congress, which it's very likely they won't even be able to pass, are very minor reforms to policing, entirely cosmetic, and don't approach any of the fundamentals of what we want. What the people in the United States are asking is for the demilitarization of our police force. That the police shouldn't be able to operate in communities with military equipment. We want a reallocation of police funding to social services and to things to address the root causes of crime. And we want community control. We want the people to have a democratic way to govern over the police departments and to set their policies and to have an impact on who gets hired and who gets fired at these police departments. And that is something that doesn't exist and the Democrats are not supporting. And without a new political force, a new political party, it seems unlikely that these reforms will be able to be won in any substantial way.
Another question that has been asked by most of the people is, what does it mean by actually defunding the police and the community control of police?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll take this question. So I guess defunding the police, community control of the police has very clear outlines and objectives. The statement of defunding the police really depends on what different situation and what different person's feelings have on the police. Some people think a 5% defunding of the police would be good enough, while some people want to see like 50% defunding of the police, like half of the police losing half of their funds and those funds being redirected to public services such as housing, healthcare, etc., etc. So the reason why defunding the police is so vague is because it just is genuinely a vague claim. Like, I think that some people might have more specific plans about how they want to go and defund the police department in their specific precinct or locality, but there's no real definitive plan for everyone about it. Now, community control of the police, that's a very specific objective that people have and has very specific demands. So what people are asking for, and this was again created by Chicago, by Frank Chapin and the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, is a civilian police accountability council. which would mean one, a board of civilians. We say civilians and not citizens because we also want undocumented immigrants to have the chance to get on the council. A board of civilians elected by the people with the power to independently review, investigate, and censure the police. Meaning, instead of these internal investigations the police do where they investigate themselves, this external board gets to have the real power and right to investigate the police, to hold them accountable for their actions, to subpoena them, to even help with negotiating for police contracts and the money they get and the funding they get. Two, no conflicts of interest in this board of elected civilians who are holding people accountable. There are no police officers, people related to police officers, people who are retired police officers allowed. And it would be a real thing with teeth, just meaning the ability to have real power over police officers in a way that some things you hear about don't. Like, for instance, in Tallahassee, they've created a citizen review board for the police department. It has 86 members on it. It has no real power to investigate the police independently. And so, because of the disarray and trying to have that many members agree or decide or vote on anything unanimously, and the fact that it lacks power in the first place, nothing will get done on the citizen review board. It won't change anything fundamentally about how the police operate. And so the fight for community control of the police and the fight for a CPAC, Civilian Police Accountability Council, is the fight for creating a mechanism that gives the people a real board of elected officials who can hold the police accountable.
Yeah. On defunding the police, so one of the issues is that in American cities, I'd say approximately like 1/3 of municipal funds goes to police departments in American cities. So it's, it gets funded more than any other municipal or social services, which is, I think, one of the motivations and kind of driving behind the push to defund is that people see, these police departments get hundreds of millions of dollars, while there is still, child hunger, there's still infant mortality, there's still people living in poverty, and yet, the police are able to operate, with militarized equipment. What we've seen in the United States is that a lot of equipment from the U.S. military, after it's retired, is then sold off to police departments for them to use, so that they police, Black communities in the United States as an occupying army, the same way the U.S. military occupies countries around the world. That is how the police operate in the Black community in the United States, with the same tactics, the same equipment, and the same approach. And so it's something that angers people, and that's kind of a motivation for the defunding. And we put a focus on the community control because we really think that the key issue in question is the question of power, and that, without some democratic mechanism for people to exert power over the police, that this situation will not change. We'll probably see in the United States police departments getting renamed or rebranded. They'll change the police department to be the public safety force, or they'll do all these little changes to try to pretty up what they are and what they're about. But until the balance of power, until there is democracy where people are able to have a say about who polices them and how they're policed, that these fundamental issues won't change.
Okay, we have another question. Was wondering what kinds of responses have there been from within the police factions? Not sure if there were any official statements, but has there been any support for the movement and protest from within the ranks of the law enforcement? Especially asking this, considering that there are members of the Black community who are policemen too. What are the politics involved in that position?
That's an interesting question, honestly. Would you like to take that, Zach?
Yeah. So it's definitely interesting. I think that so one thing that happened, America, when it was a segregated society under Jim Crow, a system of kind of apartheid in the United States. Black people were kind of uniformly um, oppressed, by the system. But after the great Black freedom struggle and civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, um, we've had a kind of a transition to, I think, what some would say a more neo-colonial um, kind of approach, if you want to carry the analogy into the United States, where you're able to have a small section of the Black population enter into becoming business owners, into becoming professionals, and into joining the police forces. Um, and sometimes, and broadly, even members of the Black community who are able to achieve these positions do have some solidarity, but the situation is very difficult. So what I've seen is I've seen a couple cases of police officers in the United States who have wished to show solidarity with the movement, and they've either been fired or they've been forced to quit or leave the police departments, uh, unable, basically not being permitted to retain their position and show solidarity. So many Black police officers, if they do have solidarity with the movement, are probably frightened to speak out or to say anything. What we've seen in the United States is that Black police officers, when they're off duty and they're not in uniform, actually cases of them getting shot and killed, by white police officers in their departments, to be harassed, discriminated against. So I think, there's different approaches, but I'd say, some Black people are forced to leave the police departments or are fired or are, basically forced out. Some stay quiet and, don't, put their head up, out of fear of something happening. And some, have chosen to just integrate, and they don't show solidarity with the movement because they've achieved like a higher position. And so they don't relate anymore with the masses of poor Black people.
I think that's a really good analysis. And I think it's important to kind of like talk about the entirety of the relationship of the police with the police officers who do genuinely, I think, want to do good for the community and conduct, as rare as that is, and as much as people are silenced by peer pressure and by the training that police officers go through. There have been multiple instances of police officers trying to speak out about the abuse and conduct of their organizations, the abuse and conduct that police commit against other people. And whenever, trust me, a police officer is almost never punished for their conduct unless they are disagreeing with the police force and disagreeing with the actions that police and their organizations or precincts have made. And so there's a very tight-knit kind of like line that police officers take and work together. And I don't think that there's like a lot of internal dissension in their ranks, a lot of breaking up of their internal unity, because the police have always been an organization that has relied on this fraternal relationship with each other, this close-knit quote unquote brotherhood. And for any who don't opt into or buy into that idea, they will be harassed or kicked out as quickly as possible to make room for someone who will be. And so I don't think that there's been any genuine change in like the police or conduct. I think at best, police officers now know to be nicer to people, but even then, I think sometimes their kindness that they show even to protesters, that's never solidarity. It's either to put a nice face on for everyone or to cover up for the media.
Yeah, like seeing the news in which, like, even with the cameras on them, still they are not actually nice on the protesters. Like, we have seen brutal videos of police brutality on the protesters. We are seeing it every day. So yeah, I can see how that is turning out. Like,
Hello.
Hello.
yeah,
So,
yeah, go
this is.
ahead.
Can I ask a question, Pranam?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, what is there is a recent shooting in United States where someone who ran with a taser and put it towards the policeman was killed. What was his name? I forgot his name. He was a black man. What was shocking to me is I went to the Twitter and tried to decipher what people are saying. So the pro-police people are saying that if you resist the police will shoot back at you. Either this is the argument, or the argument is police killed him because of self-defense, or police did the protocols that they are going to abide by. So they are basically justifying murder. These people basically justifying murder, citing that he has done something wrong. What the shocking part is, I already knew that there are some nutty people inside the political right as well as left. What was shocking to me is they are actually saying that murder is justified. See, they could have said that arrest is justified or something is justified, which was non-lethal. They're actually going that far to say that murdering his life, taking his life was justified move by the police because the police felt threatened. If the police felt threatened, what kind of police that is?
Yeah.
This is what I say every day. Because it's like, for one thing, following the police's protocols or training is excuse, because let's admit it, the entirety protocols and training is skewed and messed up. This is the way they are trained is wrong. The way they are taught to police people is wrong. We need to admit that and say that out loud, because there's nothing about their training that gives them an excuse for their actions. Secondly, you are a fully armed, trained person with a gun, a taser, so many mechanisms that keep you safe. There's no reason for you to murder someone. You have so much backup and resources within the community and city. You do not have to kill someone for their actions. Like, it's just not reasonable that murder has to be what happens. Like, should you, I don't know, like, of course, the situation's complicated because the entirety of the policing system in the United States of America is corrupt, and there's not really much to be said about it. But, like, how can you justify the police murdering someone extrajudicially? The whole problem is these people may have committed crimes, but they deserve to be tried alive. They deserve to be held accountable for their actions alive. They don't just deserve to be killed because the police officer feels scared. And that's an excuse I've heard maybe 1,000,000 times to justify so many police killings. Yeah. That's real. Not even within the political left of America, people think that, even though I think those views are thankfully slowly changing. But I think people just have this very skewed idea of justified force. And even though they act like they hold police officers accountable to a higher standard or level, they often treat them like they're victims in the situation rather than trained public servants, which they are not, but should be.
The whole point of the police department is to minimize the number of deaths. Yeah. And the crazy thing here is they're actually, see, the police, there are so many police to help the other police, right? There are 4 or 5 police out there, or 3 or 4. Anybody, they don't have a problem in terms of defense. If the situation arises, they can save themselves. Their first instinct, whenever they see any problem, their first instinct is to murder. What kind of stupid training is this? Like, I cannot comprehend. Like, this problem also exists in India. So it's not like the US is.
Do you have any more questions?
Oh,
Hello?
Hello. Yeah. So the question was that the question? Is it
I
over?
think you might be on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hello?
we can hear you.
Delilah, I think she can't hear us.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I was
Hi.
saying is,
I can't hear you.
can you hear me?
Can you quit and then rejoin?
Okay. Hello.
Okay,
Delilah, can you hear me?
I can keep
Pranab,
talking.
Pranab.
I'm gonna try to
Yeah.
see maybe she can
Pranab,
quit and
can you hear me?
rejoin.
Yeah, I can hear you. Just
I can hear you.
yeah.
Or Pranab can listen to my question and refresh. That's if that's the
Yeah.
problem. So my
Fine.
question is,
Just
the first instinct of the American police, it seems, is
Mhm.
whenever there is a slight sense of danger, they try to kill. They attempt to kill even the unarmed people, right? So
yeah.
and that kind of similar thing is also there in India in terms of encounter and things like that. Whenever they see someone as potential terrorist, they kill them. This the whole utility of police, the whole philosophy behind police is to minimize the number of deaths and crimes in the society, but the number of crimes that is being done by the police is itself a huge number. So the whole purpose of police is being lost here. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that in many ways, how the police force operates is to enact terror, and I think that for us, we go back and think about the history of lynchings in the United States. The fact is that during the whole period of Jim Crow in the beginning of the 20th century, white vigilantes in cooperation with local police would often find and hang and execute Black people as a way of enacting a form of terror to maintain the system of oppression. And I think that, the functionality of police killings and shootings carries out the same thing. In the American media, in our culture, in TV shows, Black people are widely portrayed as violent criminals, as a people who need to be controlled and dominated and killed. And I think that when the police operate, they are following entirely in this racist mindset, where they view every Black person as a violent criminal who needs to be suppressed, and they will often shoot and kill to make an example.
Okay. So one last question. Hello. Yeah. So the final question.
Hi, I can hear y'all now.
Yeah. So the last question. So what are the future strategies for this movement? Like from now, where to go? So like, what are your thoughts on that?
There is a lot to be said about what can be like moving and what we can be moving and fighting for the future. I think like specifically for Tallahassee Students for a Democratic Society, the movement and strategy for the immediate future is to fight for cutting ties with the Tallahassee Police Department in any way on Florida State University's campus, is to fight for community control of the police for the community and building a better relationship with the Black community of Tallahassee to understand and connect more for a movement for Black liberation. I think that for the larger movement, for the nationwide movement, it's getting people to create structures that create fundamental changes in the people's relationship with the police, fighting for community control of the police to become something passed and implemented nationwide, and fighting constantly for a process of greater accountability and transparency for police brutality and violence, as well as greater education for police brutality and violence. In Chicago, they teach people about the Black sites where they tortured Chicago citizens, the police officers. They teach people about the conduct and behavior of police officers in class. People need to be learning that history.
And I think, oh, go on.
Yeah, can I put a small question here?
Absolutely.
Okay, we are actually running out of time, Jim. That's right.
Just food for thought. Food for thought.
Okay, fine.
If that is okay. The similar kind of racism strain is there also in India, in which the way beauty is viewed is the more fairer you are, the more beautiful you are, in terms of girls or boys also. When someone sees a black face, immediately he or she thinks that he or she may be ugly. Even in textbook, when there is a beautiful or ugly description of beautiful and ugly, ugly is always a black woman or black man, and beautiful is a fairer man or fairer woman. And this kind of picture is inside the brain. Like people, even some people who try it, they cannot overcome this standard of beauty from their mind. Like this is ingrained. How to fight that? Like what we can do to fight this ridiculous color standard in terms of beauty, because this is one of the source of racism worldwide.
Okay.
And also Malcolm X had a speech where he quoted that the most oppressed race is black woman, who taught you to hate your own skin, who taught you to hate your own nose, who taught you to hate your own lips, something like that. So in that speech he articulated why this and how the society imposed this kind of disgusting and destructive concept of beauty inside the mind of black people. So what we can do for to help this
counter that? Yeah.
Do you want to take it? I can answer real quick.
You can answer, yeah, because I answered the last question.
Yeah. So I think about one of the kind of great leaders in the Black Freedom movement, Stokely Carmichael, or known as Kwame Ture. He has a quote. I'm gonna paraphrase, but it's if you are prejudiced against me, that's your problem. But if you have the power to enact that, then that's my problem. That is to say that, racist attitudes are a serious problem, which is going to require, a great, cultural and societal transformation. But what lies at its root is the question of power. That if Black people have power in our society, and in general, if oppressed people have power, in this world, then that is going to be the fundamental thing, which puts an end to acts of racism and acts of oppression. That until oppressed people have real political power, then we can't even start to talk about these greater societal and cultural conversations. So, that analysis leads us to talk, how, in our view, we think that in the Black communities and in the U.S. South, the historic homeland of Black people within the context of the United States, a real system of Black political power needs to exist so that there can be self-determination. And that is going to be the key thing.
And just to add really quickly to that, I think in times we've seen kind of like this movement showing that like Black is beautiful. The movement of Black power, that's come out of places where Black people have had radical access to real political power, have been able to build a political base and movement that can change people's consciousness of how they identify and view their Blackness. The only way to do that is for Black people to have increasing political power and accreditation in our country. And even this movement particularly it's being co-opted, but in some ways people are making avenues in which they kind of like decrease anger and frustration through media and film and giving Black people more access within that, which isn't always good, but can give Black people more of an avenue towards seeing themselves in a positive light. It's always struggle that breeds a greater consciousness and understanding of, Black people's power and beauty.
Okay, I think we are coming to the end of the webinar. Thank you, Zach and Delilah, for the enlightening us about the movement that is currently going on in US. And after listening to you, I can like kind of understand the similarities that the movements that was happening in India the past few months against the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, and how similarly it was here also. It was a student-led protest which was mobilized in almost all the cities across India, and it too was a very diverse protest in which it was not just the community that were directly affected by it, but everyone rallied for that cause. And I think listening to your conversation about the protest that is happening there, and how the protest has been nurtured and how it is being kept on going and pushing for the reforms and everything, the lessons that we can learn is enormous. And I hope we can have discussions like this in future in which we can exchange ideas about how to lead people and how to raise our voice against systematic oppression against all the people that are suffering right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us on.
Giving us the time.
Thank you, and
we'll definitely.
And also,
go on.
Sorry.
Yeah. So from the student collective IIT Bombay for Justice, we would like to give a proposal that the student activists here also would like to talk about our protests that we have been having for the past few months here, and the things that we learned from it, and we would like to share it with you. So we would like to have a platform for that to happen, just like right now how we are having.
Absolutely. And I know many Americans are not at all familiar with the struggle you're waging against the citizenship law, and I think that it could be very powerful for people here to hear about it. So I very much look forward to that. I really enjoyed this conversation today.
Thank you so much. Y'all are wonderful. I really appreciated being able to speak to you, and I'm so interested and excited for what y'all can teach us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are learning that like we are more similar than we are different, actually.
Absolutely.
Unity.
Yeah.
The struggle is same everywhere.
Yeah. Sure. So I think it's morning for you guys. So have a nice day.
Thank you.
And it's night for us. So to everyone who is watching in India, good night.
All right.
Good night, y'all.
Good night, y'all. Look forward to talking more.
Good night.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Bye.